The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and disappointment. I sat there, watching my brother Alexander lean back in his chair with that smirk I'd seen 1,000 times before, the one that said he'd already won before the game even started. The will reading had just concluded, and the division of our father's estate was exactly what everyone expected. Alexander got the oil fields in Texas, 3 massive operations worth approximately $40 million. Our sister Victoria received the investment portfolio and the Manhattan penthouse. Our youngest brother James inherited the shipping company, and me, I got a jar of dirt. Not metaphorically, an actual mason jar filled with reddish-brown soil, sitting on the mahogany table like some kind of cruel joke. The room had gone silent when Mr. Whitmore, our family attorney, had placed it in front of me with an apologetic look. "Your father was very specific about this bequest, Sophia," he'd said quietly. "This jar contains soil from a plot of land in Nevada that he purchased many years ago. The deed is yours as well." Alexander's laughter had filled the room, rich and mocking. "Well, Sophie, looks like Dad knew exactly what you were worth after all." The others had tried to hide their amusement behind their hands, but I saw the way Victoria's shoulders shook, the way James bit his lip to keep from grinning. 23 years of being the family disappointment, and this was my father's final judgment, a jar of dirt from some worthless patch of desert. While my siblings divided an empire worth hundreds of millions, I was given earth, common, worthless earth. But here's the thing about dirt. Sometimes it holds secrets that even the smartest people miss. Sometimes what looks worthless on the surface contains treasures beyond imagination. And sometimes, just sometimes, a father's last gift isn't what it seems. If you're watching this because you've ever felt overlooked, undervalued, or dismissed by the people who should have loved you most, then this story is for you. Because I learned that the greatest treasures often come disguised as worthless things, and the people who mock you today might be begging for your forgiveness tomorrow. Stay with me, and I'll tell you how a jar of dirt changed everything. My name is Sophia Hartwell, though for most of my life, I was just the other daughter, or Alexander's disappointing sister. In a family of overachievers, I was the one who never quite measured up. Alexander had followed our father into the oil business, becoming his right hand by age 25. Victoria had graduated from Harvard Business School and managed our family's investments with a ruthlessness that would make Wall Street wolves nervous. James, despite being the youngest, had already expanded our shipping routes into 3 new countries, and then there was me. The Skyaki, art history major. The one who spent a year teaching English in rural Thailand instead of taking the internship at Goldman Sachs. The one who worked at a small museum in Portland, cataloging artifacts and giving tours to school children, making barely enough to cover rent on my studio apartment. Our father, Richard Hartwell, had built his empire from nothing. He'd started with 1 oil well in Texas and turned it into an energy conglomerate worth $500 million. He valued 3 things above all else: ambition, profit, and legacy. I had disappointed him in all 3 categories. The last time I'd seen him alive was at Christmas, 8 months before his heart attack. We'd all gathered at the family estate in Connecticut, a sprawling mansion that looked like something out of The Great Gatsby. I'd made the mistake of bringing my boyfriend at the time, Marcus, who taught high school history and drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic. The dinner had been excruciating. Alexander had spent the entire meal talking about his latest acquisition, another oil field that would increase profits by 30%. Victoria had discussed her plan to short a failing tech company, potentially making millions in the process. James had just closed a deal with a Chinese manufacturing firm that would triple our shipping revenue. When it came my turn to share, I talked about the new exhibition I was curating on indigenous art of the Pacific Northwest. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, our father had spoken, his voice cutting through the awkwardness like a blade. "Sophia, you're 23 years old. When I was your age, I'd already made my first million. Your brother Alexander had closed 3 major deals by the time he was your age. Even James at 19 is showing more business acumen than you've ever displayed. When are you going to stop playing with your little museum toys and do something meaningful with your life? I'd tried to explain that my work was meaningful, that preserving culture and history mattered, but he'd waved his hand dismissively. History doesn't pay the bills, Sophia. Art doesn't build empires. You're a Hartwell. Act like one. Alexander had smirked from across the table. Maybe she's just not cut out for the family business, Dad. Not everyone can handle real responsibility. Victoria had added her own poison, disguised as concern. I worry about you, Sophie. What kind of future can you really have, making $30,000 a year at a museum? You can't live off the family name forever. Even James, usually the kindest of my siblings, had joined in. Maybe you should consider going back to school, Soph. Get an MBA or something useful. Marcus had tried to defend me, bless his heart, but that had only made things worse. Alexander had torn him apart with surgical precision, mocking his career, his car, his small ambitions. By the end of the night, Marcus looked shell-shocked, and I felt smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. That was the Hartwell family dynamic. If you weren't making millions, you weren't making anything at all. If you weren't expanding the empire, you were diminishing it. And I, with my museum job and my rental apartment and my boyfriend who taught high school, was the family shame. The irony was that I'd tried to fit their mold once. In college, I'd started as a business major, forcing myself through economics and accounting courses that made me want to tear my hair out. But sophomore year, I'd taken an art history elective to fulfill a requirement, and something had clicked. For the first time in my life, I'd found something I was passionate about, something that made me want to get up in the morning. When I'd changed my major, my father had threatened to cut off my tuition. Art history? He'd raged. What kind of career is that? What kind of money can you make looking at old paintings? My mother had been the one to calm him down, sweet, gentle Eleanor Hartwell, the only person in the family who'd ever really seen me. Let her follow her passion, Richard, she'd said. Not everything in life is about money. But Mom had died my senior year of college, killed by a drunk driver on her way home from one of her charity events. And with her gone, I'd lost my only advocate in the family. The criticism had intensified, the comparisons had become more cruel, and family gatherings had turned into trials where I was always found guilty of not being enough. Still, I'd carved out my own life. After graduation, I'd taken that year to teach in Thailand, despite my father's fury. "You're wasting your potential," he'd said. "A year of your life thrown away on some foolish humanitarian gesture." But that year had been the happiest of my life. I'd lived in a small village, teaching English to children who were eager to learn, experiencing a culture completely different from the privileged bubble I'd grown up in. I'd felt useful, needed, valued in a way I'd never felt at home. When I'd returned, I'd found the job at the Portland Museum of Art. It wasn't prestigious by Hartwell standards, but I loved it. I spent my days surrounded by beauty and history, sharing stories with wide-eyed children, preserving pieces of the past for future generations. My apartment might have been small, but it was mine. My salary might have been modest, but I earned it doing something I loved. Of course, my family saw it differently. To them, I was the Hartwell who'd failed to launch, the weak link in the chain of success. Every family gathering was an exercise in humiliation, with subtle and not so subtle reminders of how I'd fallen short of expectations. The worst part was that they weren't entirely wrong. By 23, I had no savings to speak of. I drove a beat-up Toyota Corolla that broke down every other month. I shopped at thrift stores and cooked ramen more often than I'd like to admit. While my siblings vacationed in Monaco and Dubai, I took weekend trips to the Oregon coast, camping because I couldn't afford hotels. But I'd made peace with it, or at least I thought I had. I'd told myself that happiness was more important than money, that following your passion was worth more than a fat bank account. I'd built walls around my heart to protect myself from my family's judgment, created my own definition of success. Then my father died. The call had come on a Tuesday afternoon while I was giving a tour to a group of third graders. Alexander had been characteristically blunt. "Dad's dead. Heart attack. The funeral is Friday. Try to dress appropriately." I'd flown back to Connecticut in a daze, not sure what I felt. Grief? We'd never been close. Relief? That seemed cruel, even if the relationship had been toxic. Mostly, I'd felt numb, like I was watching someone else's life from a distance. The funeral had been a who's who of the business world. Oil executives, Wall Street titans, politicians who owed their careers to my father's generous donations. Everyone had stories about Richard Hartwell's brilliance, his vision, his ruthless pursuit of success. No one mentioned his failures as a father, the way he'd made his children compete for his approval like gladiators in an arena. I'd stood at the graveside, watching them lower his mahogany casket into the ground, and felt nothing. My siblings had performed their grief perfectly. Alexander stoic and strong, Victoria dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, James looking appropriately solemn. I just stood there, wondering if there was something wrong with me that I couldn't cry for my own father. The will reading had been scheduled for a week after the funeral. I'd almost not attended. What was the point? I knew I wouldn't be getting anything significant. My father had made his opinion of me clear while he was alive. I didn't expect death to have softened his judgment, but Alexander had insisted. "You need to be there, Sophie. Legal reasons." So I'd flown back to Connecticut again, using the last of my savings for the plane ticket, and sat in that leather chair in Mr. Whitmore's office, trying not to think about how much the hourly rate for this meeting probably cost. The will had been exactly what everyone expected. Alexander got the crown jewels, the oil fields that generated millions in revenue every year. Victoria received the investment portfolio worth over $100 million and the Manhattan penthouse overlooking Central Park. James inherited the shipping company, smaller than the other bequests, but still worth tens of millions. And to my daughter, Sophia Eleanor Hartwell, Mr. Whitmore had read, his voice carefully neutral. "I leave the contents of Safety Deposit Box 447 at First National Bank of Connecticut and all materials contained therein." He'd produced a key and a sealed envelope with my name on it, then excused himself briefly. When he'd returned, he was carrying that jar of dirt. "This was in the safety deposit box," he'd explained, setting it carefully on the table, "along with this deed to a plot of land in Nevada, approximately 5 acres in the Mojave Desert, purchased by your father in 1987. The silence in the room had been deafening. Then Alexander had started laughing. "Oh my God," he'd wheezed, wiping tears from his eyes. "He actually did it. He actually left you dirt. This is even better than I imagined." Victoria had been more subtle in her cruelty. "Perhaps it has sentimental value," she'd suggested, though her tone made it clear she thought no such thing. James had just shaken his head. "That's cold, even for Dad." I'd stared at the jar, feeling my cheeks burn with humiliation. All those years of being the family disappointment, and this was my father's final word on my worth. A jar of dirt. Not even good dirt from the look of it. Dry and reddish, probably from some worthless patch of desert that he'd bought on a whim and forgotten about. The envelope had contained a single sheet of paper with my father's handwriting. "Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight. You always did see things differently, Sophia. Perhaps it's time that served you well." Cryptic nonsense. Another one of his tests, probably, designed to make me feel even more inadequate. I'd taken the jar and the deed, signed the necessary papers, and left the office with as much dignity as I could muster. Alexander had called after me in the parking lot. "Hey, Sophie, if you need money, I'll buy that dirt from you. I'll give you $100 for the jar. That's probably more than the land is worth." I'd kept walking, not trusting myself to speak without crying. Behind me, I could hear Victoria and James joining in his laughter. The flight back to Portland had been a blur. I'd held that jar in my lap the entire way, staring at it like it might suddenly make sense. 5 acres of desert land, purchased in 1987. Why that year? Why that land? Why leave it to me in such a theatrical way? By the time I'd gotten back to my apartment, I'd convinced myself it was just another humiliation. My father's way of ensuring that even in death, I'd know exactly what he thought of me. I'd put the jar on a shelf and tried to forget about it, throwing myself into work at the museum, but I couldn't stop thinking about his note. Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight. What if it wasn't mockery? What if there was something more to this bequest? 3 days after the will reading, I'd called Mr. Whitmore. "I need to know more about this land," I'd said. "When exactly did my father buy it? Why? Are there any other documents?" Mr. Whitmore had been patient but unhelpful. "Your father purchased the land in March of 1987 for $10,000. It was registered as investment property. There are no other documents that I'm aware of. I'm sorry I can't be of more help, Miss Hartwell." $10,000 for 5 acres of desert. In 1987, it made no sense. My father never made investments that didn't pay off. He'd had an almost supernatural ability to see value where others saw nothing. So why buy worthless land and hold on to it for over 30 years? I'd started researching obsessively. Every night after work, I'd scour the internet for information about that particular area of Nevada. It was in the middle of nowhere, hours from Las Vegas, surrounded by nothing but desert and abandoned mines from the gold rush era. Abandoned mines. That had been my first real clue. The area had been heavily mined in the late 1800s, mostly for gold and silver. Most of the mines had played out by the 1920s, leaving behind ghost towns and empty shafts. But what if my father had known something others didn't? I'd spent my savings on geological surveys, land records, anything I could find about that specific plot. My siblings would have laughed if they'd known, spending money I didn't have to research worthless land. But something drove me forward, some instinct I couldn't name. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. While researching the history of the area, I'd come across an old journal in the museum's archives. It was from a geologist named Dr. Henry Morrison who'd surveyed Nevada in the 1980s. Most of his notes were technical, boring stuff about soil composition and mineral deposits, but one entry had made my heart stop. "Surveyed the Hartwell plot today," he'd written. "Richard Hartwell is either a genius or a fool. The surface shows nothing of value, but the soil composition suggests something extraordinary beneath. Rare earth elements, possibly in significant quantities. Tried to convince him to dig, but he said the timing wasn't right. The world isn't ready for what's under there, he said, but someday it will be." Rare earth elements. I'd had to look up what those were. 17 elements on the periodic table with names I couldn't pronounce. Neodymium, dysprosium, terbium. They sounded like something out of science fiction, but they were real, and they were valuable. Incredibly valuable. These elements were essential for modern technology: smartphones, electric vehicles, wind turbines, military equipment. China controlled 97% of the world's supply, making them a strategic resource more valuable than oil in many ways, and potentially they were sitting under my 5 acres of worthless desert. But knowing and proving were two different things. I needed tests, surveys, expert analysis. All of that cost money I didn't have. I'd maxed out my credit cards on the initial research. My savings were gone. I'd even sold my car, taking the bus to work and telling myself it was temporary. That's when Marcus had left. Not that I blamed him. I'd become obsessed, talking about nothing but mineral rights and geological surveys. I'd canceled dates to pore over land records. I'd spent money we'd been saving for a vacation on soil analysis. He'd tried to be supportive, but when I'd suggested selling my mother's jewelry to fund more testing, he'd had enough. "This is insane, Sophia," he'd said. "You're destroying your life over a jar of dirt. Your father is gone. You can't win his approval now. Let it go." But I couldn't let it go. Something in my gut told me this was important, that my father had left me this for a reason. He'd been many things: cold, critical, impossible to please. But he'd never been arbitrary. Everything he did had a purpose. The soil analysis had come back inconclusive. The lab could confirm unusual mineral content, but couldn't identify the specific elements without more sophisticated testing. That testing would cost $50,000, money I definitely didn't have. That's when I'd made a decision that would have horrified my family if they'd known. I'd reached out to Tom Brennan. Tom was what my father would have called new money. He'd made his fortune in tech, selling a startup to Google for 9 figures. He'd been trying to break into the old money circles for years, desperate for the respectability that came with established wealth. He'd also been trying to date me since we'd met at a charity gala 2 years ago. I'd always rebuffed his advances before. He was 20 years older than me, with a personality that could generously be described as aggressively boring. But he had money, and I needed money. I'd pitched it as an investment opportunity. I have reason to believe there are rare earth elements on this land, I'd told him over dinner at an outrageously expensive restaurant. But I need capital for testing and eventual extraction. I'm willing to offer you a 40% stake for a $100,000 investment. He'd laughed. Sophia Hartwell asking me for money. Your father would be rolling in his grave. My father is the one who left me this land, I'd said, forcing myself to stay calm. He saw something in it. I'm just trying to figure out what. Tom had leaned back, studying me with those calculating eyes. I'll make you a deal. I'll give you the 100,000, but I want 50%, and I want you to accompany me to the Whitmore Foundation Gala next month, as my date. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was the social event of the year for old money families. Attending as Tom Brennan's date would be seen as a declaration of intent, a signal that I was open to his courtship. It would also mean facing my siblings and all their friends while on the arm of a man they'd mock mercilessly. But I'd agreed. Pride was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. The testing had taken 3 weeks. I'd hired the best geological survey company in Nevada, watched them take core samples from various points on my 5 acres. The wait for results had been agony. I'd barely slept, barely eaten, sustained only by the possibility that I might be right. When the call finally came, I'd been cataloging a new acquisition at the museum, a Native American pottery collection from the 1800s. My hands had been shaking so badly I'd nearly dropped a priceless vase. Miss Hartwell? The voice on the other end had been professional, carefully controlled. This is Dr. James Patterson from Nevada Geological Services. We have your test results. And I'd barely been able to get the word out. Your land contains one of the largest deposits of rare earth elements we've ever seen in North America. Conservative estimates put the value at approximately $2 billion, possibly more depending on extraction costs and market prices. $2 billion. I'd had to sit down, my legs suddenly unable to support me. You're certain? We've triple-checked the results. The concentration is extraordinary. Neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, all in quantities that rival the largest mines in China. Miss Hartwell, you're sitting on a strategic resource that could change America's position in the global technology market. I'd hung up the phone in a daze. $2 billion. My father had left me $2 billion disguised as a jar of dirt, while my siblings had fought over hundreds of millions. But more than that, he'd left me a puzzle only I could have solved. Alexander would have thrown the jar away in disgust. Victoria would have sold the land immediately for whatever she could get. James might have held on to it, but never investigated further. Only I, the child who'd studied history and art, who'd learned to look beneath surfaces and find hidden meanings, would have pursued this. Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight. You always did see things differently, Sophia. He'd known. Somehow my father had known that I'd figure it out. The next few weeks had been a whirlwind of legal documents and negotiations. I'd hired a team of lawyers, not the family lawyers, but my own team to handle the mineral rights and extraction contracts. Multiple companies had bid for the mining rights, each offer more astronomical than the last. Tom Brennan had tried to claim his 50%, of course, but I'd been very careful in our agreement. He'd invested in testing and extraction, not in the land itself. My lawyers had made quick work of his claims, offering him a generous return on his investment, $500,000 for his $100,000, to go away quietly. He'd taken it, smart enough to know when he was beaten. I'd kept the news quiet, telling no one except my legal team. I'd continued going to work at the museum, continued taking the bus, continued living in my studio apartment, but I'd also been planning. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was in 3 days. Every important family in our social circle would be there, including all of my siblings. It would be the perfect stage for what I had planned. I'd bought a dress for the occasion, not just any dress, a custom Valentino gown in deep burgundy that cost more than I'd made in a year at the museum. I'd hired a stylist, a makeup artist, a hairdresser. For one night, I was going to look like the Hartwell I'd never been. But more importantly, I'd arranged for some special guests. Dr. Patterson would be there, along with representatives from 3 major mining companies. The CEO of Tesla had expressed interest in attending once he'd heard about the discovery. The Department of Energy had sent a representative, and I'd made sure word had leaked to certain key media outlets. The morning of the gala, I'd received a call from Alexander. "Sophie, what the hell is going on?" He'd sounded agitated, which was unusual for him. "I'm hearing crazy rumors about that land Dad left you. Something about minerals?" "I don't know what you're talking about," I'd said innocently. "It's just 5 acres of desert, remember? You offered me $100 for it. Don't play games with me. If there's something valuable on that land, we need to discuss it as a family. Dad's estate should be distributed equitably." I'd laughed. Actually laughed at the audacity. Equitably? Like how you got 40 million in oil fields while I got a jar of dirt? That kind of equitable? That was different. Dad made his wishes clear. "Yes, he did," I'd interrupted. "Crystal clear. He left you the oil fields, Victoria the portfolio, James the shipping company, and me the jar of dirt. Those were his wishes. I'm just honoring them." I'd hung up on him, something I'd never done before. It felt liberating. The gala was held at the Whitmore estate, a mansion that made our family home look modest. I'd arrived fashionably late, partly for dramatic effect and partly because I'd been throwing up from nerves all afternoon. This was it. My moment to finally show my family and everyone else who'd dismissed me that I wasn't the failure they'd painted me as. The ballroom was packed with familiar faces, old money families I'd known since childhood, business associates of my father's, society mavens who lived for gossip. I saw my siblings the moment I walked in. Alexander was holding court near the bar, undoubtedly bragging about some new acquisition. Victoria was schmoozing with a group of hedge fund managers. James was charming someone's daughter, probably angling for an advantageous marriage. None of them noticed me at first. The dress, the styling, I looked like a different person. Not the museum curator in thrift store finds, but a Hartwell heiress in her full glory. It was Tom Brennan who spotted me first, his face going pale when he saw who was on my arm. Not a date, but Dr. Patterson, who'd agreed to accompany me as my technical advisor. "Is that Sophia Hartwell?" I heard someone whisper. "She looks incredible." The whispers spread like wildfire. Within minutes, half the room was stealing glances at me. But the real show hadn't started yet. I made my way to the bar, Dr. Patterson at my side, and ordered a champagne. That's when Alexander finally noticed me. "Sophie?" He did a double take. "What are you doing here? And what are you wearing?" "It's a party, Alexander. I'm wearing a party dress." I took a sip of champagne, enjoying his confusion. "Oh, let me introduce Dr. James Patterson. He's a geological surveyor from Nevada." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "Geological surveyor?" Before I could answer, Victoria had materialized at his side, followed quickly by James. They all stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "Sophie, you look different." Victoria said, her tone suggesting this was not a compliment in her mind. Thank you. You look exactly the same. I smiled sweetly. Dr. Patterson, these are my siblings, the ones who inherited all the valuable assets from our father's estate. Dr. Patterson, bless him, played along perfectly. Ah yes, the oil fields and the investment portfolio. Impressive inheritances, though perhaps not as impressive as... Dr. Patterson specializes in rare earth elements, I interrupted, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Fascinating field. Did you know that rare earth elements are essential for all modern technology? Smartphones, electric cars, wind turbines, none of them would exist without these minerals. A small crowd had started to gather, drawn by the tension between us and the tantalizing mention of rare earth elements. What does this have to do with anything? Alexander demanded. I pulled out my phone, showing him a photograph. Remember this, Alex? The jar of dirt Dad left me? You offered me $100 for it. His face was starting to redden. Sophie, if you're about to tell me that the worthless land Dad left me contains one of the largest deposits of rare earth elements in North America, worth approximately $2 billion, I let that number hang in the air, watched the color drain from all three of their faces. Yes, that's exactly what I'm telling you. The silence was deafening. Then someone said, 2 billion? And the room erupted. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to me. The CEO of Tesla appeared at my elbow, eager to discuss exclusive contracts. The Department of Energy representative pushed through the crowd, talking about strategic national resources. Reporters materialized from nowhere, shoving microphones in my face, but I only had eyes for my siblings, who stood frozen in place, their expressions cycling through disbelief, rage, and humiliation. This isn't possible, Victoria whispered. That land was worthless. We had it assessed years ago. You had the surface assessed, I corrected, but Dad knew to look deeper. He always did see the long game, didn't he? He bought that land in 1987, when rare earth elements were barely a blip on anyone's radar. But he knew that someday technology would evolve to the point where they'd become invaluable, and he left them to me. Why? James asked, and for once, he sounded genuinely confused rather than condescending. Why you? I thought about it for a moment, then smiled. Because I was the only one who would have figured it out. You all would have seen a jar of dirt and thrown it away, or sold it for nothing. But I've spent my career looking for hidden value in things others dismiss. Dad knew that. He gave each of us what we could handle. You got the obvious wealth, the oil fields, the portfolio, the shipping company, things that just required management, not discovery. But me? He gave me a puzzle, a test, and I passed. Alexander's face was purple now. This is ridiculous. Dad wouldn't... You don't deserve... I don't deserve it. I laughed, and it wasn't a kind sound. Tell me, Alex, what did any of us do to deserve our inheritances? You were born first and male. That's it. You didn't build those oil fields. You didn't discover them. You just inherited them because Dad deemed you worthy. Well, guess what? He deemed me worthy too, just in a different way. We'll contest this, Victoria said, her lawyer brain already working. There must be some legal avenue. To contest what? Dad's will was clear. He left me the contents of that safety deposit box and all materials contained therein. The jar, the land, and everything on or under it. It's ironclad. I've had it checked by the best lawyers money can buy. And yes, Victoria, I can afford the best lawyers now. The crowd around us was growing, everyone fascinated by this family drama playing out in public. I saw people recording on their phones, knew this would be all over social media within hours. Good. Let everyone see the Hartwell family dynamic in all its glory. You planned this, Alexander accused. This whole performance, showing up here to humiliate us. The way you've humiliated me for 23 years, I shot back. Every family gathering where you mocked my career, my choices, my life. Every dinner where you made me feel worthless because I didn't care about money the way you did. Yes, Alexander, I planned this. I wanted you to know what it feels like to be the one everyone's laughing at. And they were laughing. Not openly, most of them, but I could see it in their eyes, hear it in their whispers. The mighty Hartwell siblings, outmaneuvered by the family disappointment. It was the kind of reversal of fortune that would keep the gossip mills running for years. I need to ask, a reporter had pushed to the front. Miss Hartwell, what are your plans for this discovery? Will you be selling the mining rights? I turned to face the cameras, knowing this was my moment. I've already received several offers, but I'm being selective. This resource is too important to hand over to just anyone. I want to ensure it's developed responsibly, with proper environmental safeguards and fair labor practices, the kind of ethical business model my father never bothered with. That was a direct shot at Alexander, whose oil fields had been cited multiple times for environmental violations. His face went from purple to white. Furthermore, I continued, I'll be establishing the Eleanor Hartwell Foundation in honor of my mother. 50% of all profits from this land will go toward funding museums, arts education, and cultural preservation programs. The things that really matter, that really last. Not just making money for money's sake, but using wealth to preserve beauty and knowledge for future generations. The crowd erupted in applause. I saw approval in faces that had never given me a second glance before. But more importantly, I saw understanding. They got it now. I wasn't just the rich girl who'd gotten lucky. I was someone with vision, with purpose. You sanctimonious little... Alexander started, but Victoria grabbed his arm. Not here, she hissed. You're making it worse. But he shook her off, stepping closer to me. You think you've won? You think this changes anything? You're still the same pathetic little girl who couldn't cut it in the family business. Money doesn't change that. You're right, I said calmly. Money doesn't change who I am. I'm still the same person who chose passion over profit, who valued experiences over earnings. The only difference is now I have the resources to live my values without apology, without begging for scraps at your table, without enduring your contempt just to be included in the family. You're not family, he spat. You never were. You were always the outsider, the one who didn't belong. Because you made sure of it, I replied. Every day, in 1,000 little ways, you all made sure I knew I wasn't good enough. Well, congratulations. You succeeded in pushing me out, but in doing so, you also freed me. I don't need your approval anymore. I don't need to measure my worth by your standards. I have my own now. Dr. Patterson stepped forward then, placing a protective hand on my elbow. Miss Hartwell, the Tesla representatives would like a word. I nodded, then looked back at my siblings one last time. You know the really funny thing? If any of you had ever shown me even a moment of genuine kindness, I would have shared this with you. Even now, even after everything, if you could just acknowledge what you've put me through, maybe we could find a way forward. But you can't, can you? Even now, you can't see me as anything other than the family failure. Victoria's mask finally cracked. You want us to apologize? For what? For being successful? For meeting Dad's expectations while you played around in museums? No, I said softly. For being cruel. For taking pleasure in my failures. For making me feel like I was worth less than dirt. I held up my phone, showing the picture of the jar again. Though I guess, in the end, dirt was worth quite a lot. I walked away then, leaving them standing there in their designer clothes with their inherited millions, looking smaller than I'd ever seen them. The crowd parted for me like I was royalty, and in a way, I suppose I was now. The Hartwell heiress who'd inherited dirt and turned it into gold. The rest of the gala was a blur of congratulations and business cards. Everyone wanted to know me now, wanted to be associated with my success. The same people who'd ignored me for years were suddenly eager to reminisce about how we always knew you were special, Sophia. But the person I was most glad to see was Mrs. Chen, my mother's best friend, who'd stayed away from family gatherings after Mom died because she couldn't stand to see how my father and siblings treated me. "Your mother would be so proud," she said, tears in her eyes. "Not because of the money, but because you stayed true to yourself. You didn't let them change you." "I almost did," I admitted. "There were times I wanted to give up everything I cared about just to fit in, just to make them stop criticizing me. But you didn't, and that's what makes this so perfect. You won by being exactly who you are." As the evening wound down, I found myself on the terrace, looking out over the manicured gardens. The October air was crisp, and I pulled my wrap closer around my shoulders. $2 billion. It still didn't feel real. Quite a show in there. I turned to find James standing behind me, looking uncomfortable. "Come to defend the family honor?" I asked. He shook his head. "Come to say, I'm sorry. You're right. We were cruel. I was cruel. I knew it was wrong, but I did it anyway because it was easier than standing up to Alex and Dad." It was the first genuine apology I'd ever received from any of them. "Why now?" "Because you were right about something else too. If we'd been kind, you would have shared this with us. I know you would have. You were always the generous one, even when we didn't deserve it. Remember when I failed my first semester at Yale? Everyone else wrote me off, said I was an embarrassment, but you called me every week, helped me study over Skype, convinced me not to drop out. I'd forgotten about that. It seemed like a lifetime ago. I repaid that kindness by joining in when they mocked you," James continued. "I chose their approval over doing what was right. And now I've lost a sister and gained nothing." "You have your shipping company," I pointed out, "which will be bankrupt within 5 years if I don't adapt to new technologies. Technologies that require rare earth elements." He laughed bitterly. The irony isn't lost on me. We stood in silence for a moment. Then he said, "For what it's worth, I think Mom would have been proud of you tonight. Not for the money, but for standing up to us, for demanding better." "It doesn't fix 23 years of pain," I said quietly. "No, it doesn't. But maybe it could be a start, if you're willing." I studied him, this youngest brother who'd been shaped by the same toxic environment that had tried to break me. Maybe, but not with Alexander and Victoria. Not unless they can admit what they did. "They won't," he said simply. "They can't. It would mean admitting Dad was wrong, and they've built their entire identities on being his perfect heirs. Then they'll have to live with the consequences." James nodded, then surprised me by pulling me into a hug. "I really am sorry, Sophie, and I'm glad you got your vindication, even if it came at our expense." After he left, I stayed on the terrace, processing everything that had happened. In one evening, I'd gone from the family disappointment to the family success story. But more than that, I'd proven something to myself, that my worth wasn't determined by their standards or anyone else's. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. The bidding war for the mining rights reached astronomical levels, with companies from around the world vying for access to my land. I eventually settled on a partnership with a consortium that included Tesla and several other tech giants, with strict environmental protections and a commitment to developing the site responsibly. The first payment alone was more money than my siblings had inherited combined, but what mattered more to me was the Eleanor Hartwell Foundation, which I established with an initial endowment of $500 million. We funded museums, arts programs, scholarships for students pursuing careers in cultural preservation. Everything my father had dismissed as worthless, I elevated and celebrated. I quit my job at the Portland Museum, but not to live a life of idle luxury. Instead, I founded my own museum focused on showcasing overlooked artists and hidden histories, the kind of stories that, like my jar of dirt, contain treasures that most people missed. Alexander and Victoria never apologized. They tried various legal maneuvers to claim a share of the discovery, all of which failed. The last I heard, Alexander's oil fields were struggling as the world shifted toward renewable energy, and Victoria had made some bad investments trying to match my success. They still had their millions, but they no longer had their sense of superiority. James and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. He was the only one of my siblings to attend the opening of my museum, and he's been working to transform the family shipping company into a more ethical, sustainable business. We'll never be close the way siblings should be, but we found a kind of peace. The jar of dirt now sits in a place of honor in my office, displayed in a custom case with a plaque that reads, "Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight." Visitors often ask about it, and I tell them the story, not just of the discovery, but of the lesson it taught me. You see, my father was right about one thing. I did see things differently. Where others saw worthless dirt, I saw potential. Where others would have given up, I persevered. Where others valued only the obvious, I looked for the hidden. But he was wrong about something else. He thought leaving me that jar was a test, a way to finally make me prove I was worthy of being a Hartwell. What he didn't understand was that I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. My worth wasn't determined by what I inherited or what I discovered. It was inherent, immutable, independent of anyone else's validation. The billions of dollars were nice, don't get me wrong. Financial security is a privilege I don't take lightly. But the real treasure wasn't the rare earth elements. It was the knowledge that I'd been right all along to trust my instincts, to value what I valued, to be who I was despite the pressure to be someone else. I think about my mother often, especially when I'm working at the foundation that bears her name. She used to tell me, "Sophie, don't let them dim your light. The world needs people who see beauty where others see nothing, who find value in the discarded, who preserve what others would throw away." She was talking about art and history, but she might as well have been talking about that jar of dirt, or about me, the discarded daughter who turned out to be worth more than anyone imagined. The last time I saw Alexander was at a charity event 6 months after the gala. He'd had too much to drink and cornered me near the coat check. "You destroyed our family," he'd slurred. "You humiliated us in front of everyone." "No, Alexander," I'd replied calmly. "You destroyed our family the day you decided I was worth less than you because I didn't worship money. I just revealed what was already broken." He'd stared at me with such hatred that for a moment I thought he might actually hit me. Then his wife had appeared, apologizing profusely as she dragged him away. But just before they left, she'd whispered to me, "Good for you. Someone needed to put him in his place." That's the thing about vindication. It doesn't just change how others see you. It changes how you see yourself. For 23 years, I'd internalized my family's criticism, believed on some level that maybe I really was a failure. But standing there, watching my brother stumble away in his expensive suit, I realized I'd never been the failure in our family. The real failure was a family that measured worth only in dollars, that valued cruelty over kindness, that saw compassion as weakness and empathy as irrelevance. The real failure was a father who pitted his children against each other like gladiators, who withheld love like it was a scarce resource, who died without ever really knowing any of us. But in his own twisted way, my father had given me the greatest gift of all. Not the land or the minerals or the billions of dollars, but the opportunity to prove, to myself more than anyone, that I'd been valuable all along, that my different way of seeing the world wasn't a weakness, but a strength, that the very qualities my family had mocked were the ones that led me to my fortune. I often think about that day in the lawyer's office, sitting there with that jar of dirt while my siblings divided their millions. If I could go back, knowing what I know now, I wouldn't change a thing. Not the humiliation, not the struggle, not even the pain. Because all of it led me to this moment, this life, this understanding of my own worth. The jar of dirt taught me that value isn't always obvious, that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as worthless things, that patience and persistence can reveal riches that impatience and arrogance overlook. And most importantly, that the opinions of others, even your own family, don't determine your worth. I was recently invited to speak at my old university about my discovery and the importance of following your passion, even when others don't understand it. The auditorium was packed, full of young people who reminded me of myself at that age, uncertain, searching, worried about measuring up to someone else's standards. Everyone told me I was wasting my life studying art history, I said to them. Everyone said I should be more like my siblings, more focused on money, more practical. And for a long time, I believed them. I felt like a failure because I didn't fit their mold. I held up a photograph of the jar. Then my father died and left me this, a jar of dirt. My siblings laughed. They offered me $100 for it out of pity. But because I'd trained myself to look deeper, to search for hidden meanings, to value what others dismissed, I found $2 billion in rare earth elements. The audience gasped, but I held up my hand. The money isn't the point. The point is that the very skills everyone mocked, my attention to detail, my interest in history, my patience with research, my ability to see patterns others missed, those were the skills that led to my discovery. The things that made me a failure in my family's eyes were actually my greatest strengths. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. But how did you keep going when everyone doubted you? It was such a familiar pain in her voice, the same pain I'd carried for so many years. I almost didn't, I admitted. There were times I wanted to give up everything I loved just to fit in, but I had one person, my mother, who saw value in me exactly as I was. And after she died, I held on to her belief in me like a lifeline. Sometimes that's all you need. One person who sees your worth when you can't see it yourself. What about now? Another student asked. Do your siblings accept you now that you're successful? I thought about how to answer that. Success doesn't change people's hearts. My siblings still see me as the outsider, just a wealthy outsider now. But I've learned that their acceptance isn't necessary for my happiness. I've built my own family of friends, colleagues, and partners who value what I value. That's the family that matters. After the talk, that young woman from the front row approached me. She was studying poetry, she said, and her parents were threatening to cut off her tuition if she didn't switch to business. Everyone says I'm wasting my potential, she said, tears in her eyes, that I'll never amount to anything as a poet. I took her hands in mine. Let me tell you something about potential. My brother Alexander had all the potential in the world. Brilliant mind, perfect grades, natural business instincts. He inherited $40 million in oil fields. And you know what he's done with all that potential? Nothing. He's maintained what was given to him, maybe grown it a little, but he's never created anything, never discovered anything, never added any beauty to the world. But you, I continued, you have the potential to create something from nothing, to take words and arrange them in ways that make people feel, think, change. That's not wasting potential. That's using a rare and precious gift. But what if I end up poor? She asked. I was poor, I said. I lived in a studio apartment and ate ramen and took the bus. But I was doing what I loved, and that made me richer than my siblings with all their millions. The money I have now is wonderful, but it's not what makes me valuable. What makes me valuable is the same thing that makes you valuable. The courage to be ourselves in a world that's constantly trying to make us be someone else. She hugged me then, this stranger who felt like a younger version of myself, and I hoped I'd given her what my mother had given me, the strength to trust her own path. That's the real legacy of the jar of dirt. Not the billions of dollars or the business empire or even the vindication against my family. It's the proof that there are many different ways to be valuable, many different forms of success, many different paths to fulfillment, And sometimes the path that others mock is the one that leads to the greatest treasures. As I write this, sitting in my office overlooking the city, I can see the jar on its pedestal, the dirt inside it still reddish-brown and unremarkable looking. Visitors sometimes laugh when I tell them it's worth billions, unable to reconcile the ordinary appearance with the extraordinary value. But that's exactly the point. Value isn't always visible on the surface. Worth isn't always obvious. The things that appear worthless to some might be priceless to others. And the people who seem like failures might just be treasures waiting to be discovered. My father thought he was teaching me a lesson about business, about looking deeper, about finding hidden value. And he did. But the real lesson was about myself. That I had been valuable all along, not because of what I could earn or achieve, but because of who I was. The jar of dirt didn't make me worthy. It revealed the worth that had always been there. So to anyone who's ever been made to feel like they're not enough, like they don't measure up, like they're the disappointment in a family of successes, remember the jar of dirt. Remember that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight. Remember that the very things that make you different might be the things that make you valuable. And most importantly, remember that your worth isn't determined by anyone else's standards. Not your family's, not society's, not even your own harsh inner critics. You are valuable simply because you exist, because you see the world in your own unique way, because you bring something to the table that no one else can bring. It took me 23 years and a jar of dirt worth $2 billion to learn that lesson. I hope it doesn't take you that long. I hope you can look at yourself right now, exactly as you are, with all your supposed failures and disappointments, and see what my father inadvertently helped me see, that you are already a treasure. You just have to be willing to dig deep enough to find it. The Hartwell family story didn't end with my discovery, of course. Alexander's oil fields did eventually fail, victims of a world moving away from fossil fuels and his own inability to adapt. He came to me for a loan, if you can believe it, sat in my office, staring at that jar of dirt, and asked for $50 million to save his company. "I'll give you the loan," I said, "on one condition. You apologize, not just say the words, but really mean it. Acknowledge what you did to me, how you treated me, how wrong you were." He sat there for a full 5 minutes, his jaw working, his face red. Then he stood up and left without a word. His company went bankrupt 3 months later. Victoria tried a different approach. She showed up at my museum one day with a proposal for a family partnership, pooling our resources for greater market impact. She pitched it like a business deal, all spreadsheets and projections, never once acknowledging the years of cruelty. "This could benefit both of us," she said, as if we were strangers meeting for the first time. "I don't need benefits," I replied. "I have $2 billion. What I needed was a sister, and you couldn't give me that when it cost you nothing. Why would I trust you with my fortune now?" She left too, but not before saying, "You've become just like Dad, cold and unforgiving." Maybe she was right. Or maybe I just finally learned to value myself enough not to accept crumbs of affection from people who'd shown me nothing but contempt. James was the only one who never asked for money. He came to the museum regularly, sometimes just to sit in the quiet galleries and think. We'd have coffee sometimes, careful conversations about safe topics, art, travel, books. We were rebuilding, slowly, carefully, like archaeologists reconstructing a shattered vase. One day he said, "I think Dad knew exactly what he was doing with that will. Not just with your land, but with all of it. He gave us what we thought we wanted, and you what you actually needed." "What do you mean?" "Alex wanted to be Dad, so he got Dad's business. Victoria wanted security, so she got the safe investments. I wanted the easy path, so I got the established company. But you wanted to matter, to be seen, to prove you had value. So he gave you a mystery that only you could solve, a treasure that only you could find. In his own messed up way, I think he was trying to tell you that he did see you. He just didn't know how to show it while he was alive. It was a generous interpretation, probably more generous than my father deserved. But I let James have it. We all need our stories to make sense of our pain. The truth is, I'll never know what my father was really thinking when he left me that jar of dirt. Maybe it was a test. Maybe it was an apology. Maybe it was just one final move in the chess game he'd been playing with his children's lives. But what I do know is that it changed everything. Not just my bank account or my social status, but my understanding of myself. For the first time in my life, I didn't need anyone else's validation. I had my own.